and for the past 3.5 years, I've been working on a book about the life of Lita Lebron, and that's going to be out in the fall. So that's where I am, and that's what I'm doing. Even without the slides, it was great, right?
Is this working? Yeah, it's working. So thanks, John, and thanks for coming. I learned about your book in a very unusual way, which we were discussing earlier. One day, about 2020 or 2021, I went to my mailbox in my house, and there was this envelope in it. So I look at it, and interesting. I open the envelope, and this was inside. No note.
I explained to them before. I started writing note like the first 25, but after 1,000, I was like, I'm not writing nobody no notes.
And also, the envelope had no name on the return address, just this sort of mysterious return address. But I started looking at it, started looking at the book, and I was floored. I was just blown away because I saw a story that I knew. I did know the story, but I had never seen it told in such a rich and beautiful way. It also reminded me of a lot of other art and a lot of art that I'm interested in. It evoked many important movements in art. Immediately thought of the obvious connection, which was the long tradition of Puerto Rican printmaking. Artists like Rafael Tufino, Lorenzo Mar, even now more recently Martorell, working in woodcuts. So there's a long woodcut tradition.
Where in my slideshow?
Yeah, right, I know. Well, I'm making up for it.
I appreciate it.
But I also thought, beyond the Puerto Rican, beyond the Boricua printmaking tradition, I thought of artists like Jose Guadalupe Posada in Mexico, who did a fantastic and very, very rich and extensive series of prints and illustrations having to do with Mexican history and the Mexican Revolution. Also, the Taller de Gráfica Popular in Mexico, which is an ongoing printmaking workshop in Mexico, dedicated to telling the story of oppressed people and the long story of Mexico through very often woodcuts, but all other kinds of prints. I also thought of a movement in Puerto Rico called the Division of Community Education, DIVEDCO, who produced from 1949 onwards up until about 1989 a series of books called Libros para el Pueblo, which were also printed on newsprint, printed very cheaply, made to be distributed free to educate people about basic things such as hygiene, and this is when public education was virtually non-existent. And then I also thought of things beyond Latino culture, such as the Japanese tradition of woodblocking and books made of woodblocks. Manga books, the original, now we all know manga as comics, but before they were actually made in woodcut. As I looked through the book, I found references to art history. For instance, when you tell the story of what happened in Utuado, you have this very dramatic lead up, and the last bit of that chapter of the book is not told in words, it's told in an image, which is an image which evokes very direct evocation of Goya's firing squad, right? So the more you know, the more you can take away also. But if you don't know, then you still have the opportunity to learn from the book. I also thought of things that are unrelated, but related in some ways. For example, the graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which talks about the Holocaust, which is told as a graphic novel, right? So I kept finding all these rich references in the book, but also just stunned by the beauty of it and the power of it. German Expressionism is something that you were also going to reference in your slideshow, but which we need to say because I think it was an influence on you. But having said all that, I want to jump to Hartford, Connecticut, where we are now. And thank you for coming to Hartford. This is a city, as those of us gathered here know, Hartford is approximately 40% Puerto Rican. And it's a city where right? That's right.
That's really funny because when I was first invited, I was like, Hartford, Connecticut, really? Were they going to know me? I'd like to know my stuff. I'd like to know about this. I guess so. I'm glad. I'm happy to see that. Yeah.
And this is a population that knows its history, right? And so this is also a city where things have happened that echo the story that you tell in your book. For example, in 1983 there was a robbery here of a Wells Fargo armored car robbery, which was carried out in 1983, carried out by los macheteros, and uh, several people were involved, including Filiberto Ojeda Rios, Victor Herena. Um, is a very important. At the time, it was the largest armored car heist ever in the world. They got $7 million in cash.
Oh, wow.
And the way that story played out reminded me of the way you tell the story in your book. It's very full of amazing details. For example, the fact that part of the proceeds from that robbery were used to purchase toys. Okay, this better? Okay. Part of the proceeds were used to purchase toys, which are given out in Pope Park, which is just how far from here? Like what, a mile? Uh, but from the back of a truck, uh, the people dressed up as the Three Kings and used the money to purchase toys that were given out on Three Kings Day, right? And because of that, actually, that led to the FBI getting on to some of the people who did the robbery. Victor Herena was one of the robbers. His mother was a beloved Hartford resident. I'm sure there are people here who knew her. Gloria, Gloria Herena, Victor Herena's mother, died just a couple of years ago. She was a very beloved member of the Puerto Rican community here. And of course, Filiberto Ojeda Rios, who was one of the organizers of this robbery, was tried in Hartford. Initially declared not guilty of attacking the FBI, but he was released with an ankle bracelet, which he cut off. Then he was tried in absentia. He was tried in absentia here in Hartford, in this city, right, and declared guilty. He escaped and lived in the town of Hormigueros in Puerto Rico for many years until in 2005, was it? He was massacred by the FBI. In Hormigueros, in the town. So this is a kind of story which I invite you, and I'm sure that the crowd here would be delighted if you would take on for your your next book.
Sounds good.
What do you?
I'm interested.
So we'd be delighted if you would consider this, and I'm sure that we can provide you with a lot more details. You can find out more about it.
Sure.
So that's my little introductory spiel. The subtitle of the book is a graphic novel. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the words and the images. Did you write the whole script first and then illustrate it, or how did that work? Did you conceive of it panel by panel? Did you have all the words worked out and then came the pictures, or what was that process like as you?
When I'm making comics like that, well, the first thing I did, since it's based on history, is just like when you're in high school and you have to do a report on something, I read a bunch of books and I took a bunch of notes. And then I just made a bullet pointed list of what I wanted to happen. It starts here and it ends with the attempted assassination. So just a list. And then once I have the list, okay, well, here they are. Here they are talking to the president. What's that going to look like? That's the big part of my list. And then I make a smaller list of what's going to happen in that chapter. So then once I've got the big broad list and I've got the little tiny what's going to happen to check off that mark, then I get like sketchbook, and just with stick figures, I'm drawing out stuff. And it doesn't look like anything. It's not worth looking at. And then within that, well, it says everywhere that he had a German Luger pistol. What does a German Luger pistol look like? Even though my style it's very stylized, I still went up and I made another list. Here's things I have to look at. What is this? What would Truman's pinstripe suit look like? What does a German Luger pistol look like? What does a hat look like? And then I've got a whole list of just references. Even though if you've seen my style, I'm not really a technically tight kind of artist, but just a loose reference. After I've got stick figures and the list, I take a piece of wood, I stain it with India ink, and then I draw it out with pencil. And then when I'm carving, the words take a very long time and is very tight and technical because nobody wants to struggle to read anything. You have to flow right through it. And then the figures are very loose, where I'm drawing it one way and I'm carving it a different way. And that's basically it.
We were talking earlier. Can you hear? Yeah. We were talking earlier about process, and one of the things that I came in today really itching to ask you had to do with how you are able to carve these blocks. Because for those of you, if you know a little bit about printing or printmaking, you know that these blocks are traditional woodcuts with writing is carved in backwards. So that when you print it, it's the right way. It's like a mirror. You have to carve it as a mirror image. And so when we were talking earlier, you you gave away the secret, right?
I gave away the secret. So this is for all you printmakers out there. I've made many books backwards. Like, for instance, I made a book called Dogs of the Bronx, and I carved it backwards, and the text is backwards, and then I printed it 100 times. I really love the wood that I carved it, and by the time I'm done printing it, the piece of wood is all inky and messed up. And I started to say to myself, I really loved the wood. Now it's all stained in a mess. So for the Puerto Rican War, the wood is like a sculpture. It's the final art object where I'm carving it forward. And if you look really closely in the book, you can see my little scratch marks within the book. So I'm carving it forwards. Now to print it, you ever go to a graveyard and you get some tracing paper and you make a rubbing? Same thing as on the wood, I put it down, I put tracing paper over it. I took 10 crayons, put it in the oven in a cupcake thing, and I had a big brick of crayon, and I made a big rubbing of the wood. And then took that off, and then my lady got her sewing machine and put it on nice paper, because I'm terrible at sewing. And that was my show in Puerto Rico, was the rubbings. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I want to come back to process a little bit later if we have time, but sure. I know that there are other questions.
Sorry, that answer might have been too long.
One of the things that really struck me in the book is that, you know, the subject matter is no joke. I mean, this is about the book puts forth the idea of the validity of armed struggle, violent struggle. I think part of the moral dilemma of that comes out in the two ghosts that come to visit, the ghost of Gandhi and the ghost of Michael Collins, and they have maybe different philosophies. But another thing that I found very compelling about the book is, despite the very serious nature of these dilemmas, there's a lot of humor, and I loved that. I thought it made the story more compelling. For example, towards the beginning of the book, I think there's a very violent scene, and one of the dead people says, "I'm already dead. Please don't shoot me anymore." So I mean that's really pretty powerful. But how do you reconcile the use of humor, and how important is, where does that? I mean, it's obviously some of it comes from your personality, but what are your thoughts about employing humor in telling a story like this?
Yeah, my personality and my worldview come through in all of my artwork, just like every artist. But it's a very serious subject, and I trust that people are smart enough that they can understand how serious it is. There are a couple of jokes in there, here and there, because this might sound weird, but I try to put a little joy in it, because if you don't have any joy, you don't have any hope. And I don't want it to be hopeless. I don't know if that shines through all the time, but that's my aim. And then third of all, it does follow a lot of traditions of comic books, even though it's woodcut. A lot of comic book forms have very inventive if you take a wet towel and you smack it on something in a comic book, it'll say like thwop, THROPPPPP. And I love that, the language of comics. And so I just wanted to include that in the book as well. That's definitely a trope that I enjoy in comics, is inventive spelling here and there. So all those things combined is why I do that. Yeah.
And also, I think that one of the coping mechanisms that colonized people have developed is humor.
Sure.
As a coping mechanism, and I've seen that in our culture, but also cultures all around the world that have been colonized as a means to manage life and to
Sure. How many times my dad, if I don't laugh, I'm going to cry.
Yeah. I want to turn the conversation a little bit now towards the impact of the book overall and our situation overall as Boricuas in the United States. If polls and plebiscites are to be believed, the majority of Puerto Ricans do not support the idea of independence for Puerto Rico, which is what the nationalists were fighting for. What are your thoughts on this? What would you say to someone who expresses, for example, great admiration for the book, and they say, it's a beautiful book, love the book, but then at the same time they would say to you, oh, but the only hope is really for us to assimilate and become part of the United States and be a state or something like that?
I got a bunch of things to say. First thing I want to say, before anything, is I don't think that I should be the guy to talk to about it. My grandfather had a farm in Puerto Rico. I visited it in the summer, but I've never lived there, so I don't feel that comfortable really saying it should be this, this, and this. Everyone that I've come in contact with, to no surprise, wants independence. Of course, I'm an artist and I wrote this book, so everybody that seeks me out wants independence as well. I think that it is a giant hard road to happen with a lot of difficulties. My friends in Puerto Rico often tell me, well, the government's corrupt and we got to figure that out too. This is what I'm hearing from residents. I would love independence. I think we deserve it. I think that being treated like a second-class citizen is garbage, and we deserve better.
So how do you see the book as helping in that struggle? Which goes back to
when a guy from France calls me up and says, oh, John Vasquez, I love this book. I had no idea. Well, these things, I thought it was I'm like, who is this? But basically, he did not know two things about Puerto Rico, and I taught him, and I told him, and now he knows more than West Side Story and more that it's a nice place to go on vacation. Very, very simple. Now he knows a couple of things. And also, just to reimagine our image is sort of important. We can do anything. We're very artistic. I live in the Bronx. Once in a while, we fall down to a few stereotypes that I'm not so happy with. So I think the same way, I've said this before, the same way that Bruce Springsteen made it okay to be from New Jersey, the same way that Woody Allen made it okay to be a nerdy Jewish guy, I want to make it okay to be Puerto Rican.
More than okay.
More than okay. Yeah, that's right. It's my crowd.
So can you talk a little bit about your next project? You mentioned it briefly.
Sure. When I started the book, I had Lita Lebron in the story, and I had that going on, and I had her going on in 1954. And then after a while, I was like, wait a minute. She needs her own book. So she's a person who came from Puerto Rico to New York. She worked in some sewing factories. She was treated a certain way, and she was none too pleased, even when a lot of people around her were like, oh, I hope this lottery ticket comes in. I go, with this American dream. She was like, this is, again, like I said before, that we're being treated like garbage. And so she joined the Puerto Rican Independence Party, and I think you guys know all this. And she staged a very small
Doesn't hurt to
a very small insurrection where they unfurled on the Capitol a Puerto Rican flag. They meant to shoot guns up into the air. She's the only one that did that. The guy she brought shot into the senators. So it's about her life. It's about what brought her to do that. It takes a couple of tangents. So by the end of the book, was she just a crazy person? Did she have any reason to do this? Why was she upset? Yeah, she had some reasons to be to be upset and to understand how she was treated. And also, I should also say that there's a few stories of living in New York City that I got from my mom and my aunts who I interviewed a few times who were in New York City at the same time. So some of the anecdotes come from them. And that's what I'm working on.
So I guess my last question will has to do with the complexities of these stories, which I'm sure you'll bring into the Lita Lebron book as well. But in the current book, one of the things that struck me is that you stay away from uh, huge statements of this or that, the other, and there's complexity to the characters. In the section at the end where you give biographical sketches of the people, those biographical sketches are pretty. Um, you're not editorializing,
Hmm.
and I think that makes it a kind of richer and makes the characters more fully rounded. What do you think about that?
Well,
Is
I
this
just kind of assumed that most people that were reading it knew nothing about that person. And so I just wanted to just give them just a very broad overview.
But for example, the tendency often is to characterize certain people as saintly and other people as evil, and I don't get that so much. I get that there's an in between ground, like most of us.
Yeah, if you read the book War Against All Puerto Ricans, I think he makes them, which is a great book, I think he makes them a little saintly in that book.
That's right.
If you read the book American Gunfight, he makes them look like idiots,
Hmm.
like bumbling idiots. So I think my book is in between the two things, where I'm just stating the facts, but also you can certainly, I hope, see my love for them as well.
I think that's true, and that comes through very clearly, and that's one of the things I appreciate about it, as opposed to the other books that you mentioned. Yeah. So, did you want to? Is it time for questions? Yeah. Who's gonna?
Sure. 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 That's a good point. I think I think it might have to do a little bit with my point of view and maybe even a little bit with my tongue in cheek because if you also notice 18 people stuffed into 3 cars, I call them the Puerto Rican army. Like how is that an army? But to them, to those 18 people, we're an army. This is a war. And so I'm giving it to them. I'm disrespecting what they had thinking, what those 18 people, aka the Puerto Rican army. That's what they were.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for your work. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how wood cutting becomes this, paper production, curious about this. Well, put it this way: the characters of Michael Collins and Gandhi, and where you put in your sort of study and then depiction here, where you put them on the campo in that divide between Michael Collins and Gandhi. Where did he fit from your perspective?
Once again, my own personal view of the world came into the book. Pedro Ibiso Campos was a great admirer of the Irish Revolution. He was a great admirer of a violent revolution. Me, I love me some Martin Luther King. I really think he did a great job with what he did in the South, with the Bronx, with the bus boycott. Gandhi was able to defeat the British Army without killing anyone. So, while, man, do I admire Campos, what he did is so incredible, but I don't want to kill anyone. So, in my story, Michael Collins came to visit, but also the author got Gandhi to come visit too, you know? So, that's just a little of my own personal view of the world coming into the book. And the questions that they have for the would-be assassin about violence and about war. Of course, I leave the questions open-ended for the reader to figure out. But I'm anti-violence, and I couldn't just promote violence without feeling like a bit of a hypocrite since I'm a bit of a pacifist. And that's why I put him in there.
If I can just add something, but that to me is why it's so interesting that you're taking on Lolita, because Lolita, as you said, she shot, but she shot into the ceiling. She shot up, and her note said que no vine a matar a nadie. You know, like I didn't come to kill anyone. You know. Anyway,
Yeah, I take it a bunch of places. Yeah.
vine a morir por Puerto Rico, por la patria. You know, that's.
Just a comment on that the Lolita Lebron image came out after January 6th because it was January 6th was probably the attempt right after, how do you say this? Second attempt after this independence. So it was interesting to see that resurfacing. But my I'm gonna try not to make my personal history here, but I've heard this story. I grew up in Puerto Rico. I came here like 7 years ago, and I've heard this story so many times. Going to do my bachelor's degree in a public university, you hear it from many independentistas, profesores that they devote to tell the story like it is and to make you realize the hardships that we had to go through, to move from Spain to moving into the United States hands. And hearing that it was your father that was telling you these stories, him being a policeman, right? The policia.
He sure was.
How does this two things transpose? Like, because for me, police is like an agent of force, and of like we have to follow the rule, and this is what is best. And how this whole play out? Because my grandma, in my case, try to ignore our history, try not to suffer it too, because she lived part of it, like the end years of that too. And so, just want to hear a little bit more about that, about this, like, and why was your father trying, telling you these stories?
My father was NYPD, and he's a very complicated guy. He did not live down to any of the stereotypes of NYPD. He got in trouble once because he didn't bring his gun to work. Um, but to him, he spent a long time just trying to make money. He was a Marine when he got out of high school. What do I do? The Marines want you. He was a Marine. He came back. What do I do? We can be a cop. Well, that's a steady paycheck. That's a pension. He was a cop. That's what he did. And when he got home from being a cop, he came home and said, these protesters, they just want attention. They're the worst. Also, don't trust cops. He's a complicated guy. Complicated guy. And so, yeah, he was a cop, and he told me about Puerto Rican independence at the same time.
Hi, I really appreciate you coming to talk, especially as someone who has been in a lot of predominantly white spaces and seeing a room full of other Puerto Ricans talking about Puerto Rican history is very awesome. It's something I haven't experienced a lot in my life. And so my question is sort of pertaining to those predominantly white spaces and having those conversations there. I'm currently something that I heard you sort of reference a bit that you've been doing. So I just wonder, like, what's some advice you have for having these conversations in those spaces where we are surrounded by each other and have that, solidarity?
Um, just know that when you're by yourself, we got your back. We're thinking good thoughts for you. um, sometimes I definitely do feel like an ambassador, for Puerto Rico, which is like a job I gave myself. You know, sometimes I feel like I can't live up to it. Mi español es terrible. Um, in the Bronx, I get like, you don't look Puerto Rican. I actually made a book called What Do Puerto Ricans Even Look Like? And it's just a bunch of different types of people. Um, however, when I went to Puerto Rico the first time, man, did I know I was Puerto Rican. So many hugs, so many, you're our family. We don't care if your Spanish sucks. Your family, get over here. Um, and it's important. And just know that, I mean, sometimes you might not be in the mood to teach everybody about Puerto Rico. You just want to eat a sandwich. But it's important.
Or in Alcapurria.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's just important. So just keep carrying the fire. That's all I'm going to say about that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask about the book itself that you made out of wood. Is it the same size, or did you reduce the size to make the book?
No, the original blocks are about like that like that big, which is a pretty common thing in comic books. Is you make it a little bit bigger, and then when you shrink it, it looks a little more tight. Graphically. All comic books are made a little bit bigger. So yeah, like this big maybe.
But I wanted to follow up on that question because remember I had a few more questions about processes. So what kind? It's not plywood, right? Because plywood, when you cut into it, that's laminated. What kind of wood is it?
It's MDF,
MDF. Okay. You all know what that
which
is? Okay. MDF is a wood product. It's fabricated out of wood fibers, but it's put together with an adhesive, right? It's
it's way more firm than linoleum. It'll give you arthritis faster than if you carve linoleum. But it doesn't have a wood grain, so you can really change directions without having to worry about the grain. And it's also cheap, which is important, unfortunately. I have it coated. I coated it with a sealant. Yeah, as well. Well, I've been a public school teacher since 1997. I sold the original artwork of the Puerto Rican War to the Rare Book Museum in Toronto, and so I'm off this year. I took the money and I just made myself off just to work on my book. If I publish and sell all the original artwork for the next book, I won't teach next year either. But I'll go back to teaching eventually. I was an art teacher. Big surprise.
Question?
I know that you did say it took 6 years to make the book, and what was it like trying to stay focused in that journey?
It's a good question because when I was working on it, nobody cared. You know, I carved on both sides of the wood because I didn't think I would sell it and nobody would care. It kind of made me a little more free since I knew nobody would care, but I take myself really seriously. Even when I was a little kid, I used to make a comic called Moose Man, and I had a schedule that I would put it out and show it to nobody. It's just. So I just take myself really seriously. So I've got half my living room is dedicated to my art practice. I sit and I hold my head and I take it seriously. That's all. I don't know. I'm just obsessed. I'm sorry?
are there books outside?
Yep. We got books for sale at the bookstore if you haven't gotten them. And John is going to be signing the books after.
Okay. Any last question?
Yeah, anything else?
Um, when he did the Fantastic Four, I think that's greater than any pop artist has ever been. You can see a lot of connections to German Expressionism in the blocks he makes, but so many just pages and panels are just so stunning. So the Fantastic Four with Doctor Doom is definitely, what a look he had. What a guy. Yeah, you guys should, if you don't know, check out Jack Kirby, who made the look of all the first Marvel characters.
So I'll just finish up with one last question.
Sure.
As a teacher, how do you feel that your teaching and your work as a teacher influences and enriches your work as an artist?
A couple of things. I remember when I was first teaching, and these little kids we were painting, and a kid took blue and yellow. He was like, "I made green," and they acted like they were the first person to ever discover how to make green. And I was like, "Yeah, you did." And just to be around that all the time, I made green. I was like, yeah, art is great, isn't it? It's the best. You can make green.
So take your green out of your wallet and take it to the bookstore.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.